So September 11th, 2001, I was at home. I normally work a 4 to 12 shift, but it was early in the morning, so hadn't reported for duty yet. I got a call from my aide, and he said, "Have you heard about the plane crash?" And I was aware it was a perfectly clear day. It was really difficult to imagine how an aircraft could strike a building on a perfectly clear day. And most people have that impression when they first heard about the crash. And so I called into our dispatch center and asked them if they needed my response. At the time, I was a chief officer, and we each had separate responsibilities, usually assigned to one of the 5 boroughs or the training academy. I was assigned to the Bronx at the time, and picked up my aide on the way in at Fort Totten, and we headed into Manhattan. The entire time we're monitoring the police frequency, the fire frequency, and of course our own EMS frequencies, listening to the progress. So we're in Queens. We get over the Kosciuszko Bridge, and we can see all of Manhattan and a huge plume of smoke rising from lower Manhattan. And the overhead electronic sign as we go past the Kosciuszko Bridge says, "New York City closed." And that was kind of a frightening image to look at. And so we proceeded in monitoring all of the frequencies, and I'm trying to determine what is the best function for me at this point. Listening, there are a number of chiefs already down at the site. One more chief isn't probably going to make a lot of difference. So my training, we had all received training in the incident management system, which breaks down a large-scale incident into different sectors. So while someone is doing command, someone else is doing triage, someone else is responsible for transportation and tracking of patients, someone else is responsible for staging. So being familiar with that and listening to the activities that were going on down in lower Manhattan, I thought that the best utilization for me would be at the Brooklyn side of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I could establish a casualty collection point. So rather than having Manhattan ambulances leave the borough, they could come right to Brooklyn, drop off patients, and I could be responsible for distributing those patients onto hospitals, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, anywhere where we had to go, because Manhattan is going to be gridlocked with exiting traffic, and 2, all of the ambulances are going to have trouble getting up into Manhattan hospitals because of that. And I thought utilizing outer boroughs, maybe out of state, we could set up a medevac and transport patients out from there. So that's why I felt I would do the most good. And another chief heard me, and she responded into the same location to assist. By the time we got to the Brooklyn side, the second tower had collapsed and the radio was silent. And that was a really frightening moment, thinking that I might be one of the only 2 EMS chiefs to have survived. So at that point, I assumed command of the operation. I asked for a roll call of EMS chiefs to determine who was operational, who was not. And then I selected an EMS captain who was at my casualty collection point and asked him to go into Manhattan and do reconnaissance and determine what the status was going on over there. At this point, we didn't know anything. We didn't know who was responsible. We didn't know if this was a bomb. We didn't know if there was nuclear material there, if there was biological material. And I felt the best thing to do would be to run the operation from the Brooklyn side until we had more information. So within about a half an hour, I got a report from that captain that said things appeared to be safe, and my aide and I went, well, actually before that point, we had fire companies coming up to us looking for direction. And I asked one of the fire companies, an engine company, if they could set up a fog nozzle, which essentially is a misting spray, so that all the people who were coming over, thousands and thousands of people who were coming over the Brooklyn Bridge to get away from the incident, could at least decon themselves through the spray. And so that was actively happening. Of course, we didn't know how toxic this material was till later, but we were able to do a lot of decon from the Brooklyn side. So I proceeded into Manhattan. We always keep masks in the car, although they were basically N95 masks, nothing terrific, but better than nothing. And I got to Chambers Street and West Street, and we reestablished the EMS command post there. Most of the chief officers, EMS chief officers, had scattered, and then when word came out that we had reestablished our command post back at Chambers and West, that's where we gathered to establish a plan. One of the strangest things, we've been doing multi-casualty incidents for years and years and managing them through the incident management system, but nobody, of course, had ever dealt with anything on this scale before. We dealt with subway accidents with 100 patients, bus accidents, fires with multiple injuries, but to deal with 1,000 patients, we had done it only once before, and that was at the Trade Center in 1993, where EMS treated about 1,000 patients. Not all were transported, but we transported a good number of them. In this case, we dealt with the crews, the first two crews on the scene on 9/11 did exactly what they were supposed to do without any direction whatsoever, and that was pick up the most critical patient and transport that patient to the appropriately categorized hospital, meaning burn patients went to burn centers, replant candidates with amputations went to replant centers, trauma patients went to trauma centers. They all did exactly what they were supposed to do without direction. And that's from the drills we do, and that's from the training we do. And we were very impressed with how they worked independently without supervision. When we reestablished command post-collapse, there were almost no patients. It was a very strange environment, and that there was paper floating from the sky. There was clouds of dust, and we had to determine our strength, who was operational, who was not, in terms of ambulance crews, where was all of our equipment, what vehicles were available for transport. Many, of course, were crushed. Many of the crews were dazed. But after running for their lives, they turned around and came back to work. It was very impressive to see this group, relatively young people, coming back into the environment to do whatever they could. And we spent the remainder of the day doing exactly that, retrieving equipment, counting people, accounting for them, accounting for radios, trying to reestablish command. Probably the most frightening part was we didn't know, of course, what we know now, who was responsible, what the extent of this attack was. We felt that this could be the beginning of World War III. We didn't know. We had heard that air traffic had been shut down nationwide, yet you would hear a jet overhead and you didn't know, was that ours? Was it an enemy aircraft? Were they coming back in to finish off the first responders? It was a terrifying moment. And when I look back later, I think this was one day. People in combat do this every day for weeks and months, a year at a time. So as terrifying as it was, I give all my respect to those in the military who have to deal with this on a constant basis. Regardless, our hierarchy, many of the fire commanders have been killed in the first or the second collapse. So the people we depended on for safety decisions, for operational decisions, were no longer there. And the chief of operations, Dan Nigro, he was the one who stepped up and took over the fire operation. And from that point, we essentially ran two parallel operations: fire doing their thing with recon and rescue, and the EMS folks treating the patients that they could find and reestablishing staging areas, triage areas, treatment areas. And there was a response from the medical community where St. Vincent's Hospital, Beacon Downtown Hospital, a lot of hospitals sent staff to the site, totally unprepared, not equipped in terms of their gear. They were there just to help. As I recall, St. Vincent set up a makeshift operating room across the street, across West Street, in one of the buildings, anticipating all kinds of horrendous injuries, which after the collapse, there really was none. We saw very, very few patients. It was normally you would have maybe 10% of the patients generated at an incident would be critical, and the rest would be various stages of serious and minor. We saw almost nobody post-collapse, other than some respiratory injuries from the rescuers. Quite a few of those who we provided oxygen, and nobody wanted to be transported. You couldn't get a firefighter or a cop to go to the hospital. Eye injuries from the dust, but it was incredible that there were, you either made it out or you didn't. That was essentially it. And when we looked around, we found some equipment, but what you didn't see was anything substantive. You didn't see a desk or a telephone. All you saw was everything that had been in the buildings was pulverized. And so you translate that to humans, and it's clear why nobody survived, because it pulverized everything. Pulverized concrete, the force of the collapse, it's going to pulverize anything that's just tissue and bone. So we spent the next 5 months down there doing 12-hour shifts, and you would work 12 hours and then you'd be off for 12 and then have to go back in for another 12. And it was grueling. It was just, I did the overnights, and my body doesn't adjust well to midnight shifts, but we all went down, we did our part, standing by during the course of the rescue and the recovery phases. Every time we found remains, they were treated with the utmost respect. The biggest problem was on 9/11, I should say, one of the problems was the medical examiner staff had been seriously injured, and they were no longer capable of performing the task of identification and removal. So that task fell onto EMS. And EMS folks, we do deal with deceased bodies, but not on a scale like this. And this was a tremendous stress on our staff to have day after day to go in and do removals of bodies and body parts. Very, very tough on the crews. And yet you had people who volunteered and said, I will go. I want to be there to help with closure for the families. If it's a fingernail, if it's anything, we will transport. We will take care of it. And so that went on for months until they eventually shut down our operation, and it became a demolition job and a cleanup. So that's, I guess, going back to the fact that so much of the hierarchy was lost at the incident. With less experience, stepped up into the next level of command was extremely gratifying to see that, because we all trained alike, we all knew what to do. And it was very impressive to see how well people took the new responsibilities upon themselves.
It sounds like with that whole misting operation, that you saved a lot of lives just doing that, or saved some from more serious health issues, right?
Well, if you look back on it, I suppose so. It's just something that it was a trick I learned when we did a 5-borough bike tour once, when the temperature was in the upper 90s. And at the very end, out in Staten Island, we had patients who were not quite at the point of heat stroke or heat prostration, but we decided we'd get the fire department to set up fog nozzles. And so I took that experience and brought it into 9/11 and said, why don't we do that here? And and it worked. And a lot of people who were just absolutely covered in this toxic dust had an opportunity to at least clean themselves off. It was a nice enough day that it wasn't cold out, so getting them wet wasn't going to compromise their health.
Let me ask you, because you were down there for months, you were there that whole day. How's your health?
Fortunately, I'm doing well. I had an experience when renovating the house where I got lead poisoning, sandblasting an old chimney. So I was aware of protective gear, using masks, and my responsibility that day was running EMS command post. I was not in charge. There were people of higher rank who were making the command decisions, but it was my responsibility to communicate all the things that transpired to the people that had to implement them, as well as to the dispatchers to keep them apprised. And if we needed additional resources, I would redeploy them from one location to another. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but you can repeat it if I didn't.
No, that's okay. And how has it been for you with post-traumatic stress?
I think being an EMS allowed me to develop coping mechanisms. It's not a career that everybody picks or everybody survives in. So if you can develop those coping mechanisms for the daily trauma that you have to deal with, it better equips you to move forward through an incident like this. So without getting into graphic details, not everybody survives this. They do it for a year or two. We always recommend to try it as a volunteer on a community ambulance and see if it's for you, because it's not for everyone. So for me personally, I've been doing okay. Unfortunately, over the years, I've lost several friends from 9/11 illnesses. And that's probably the toughest part at this stage, that this job just doesn't end. It goes on, and every few weeks you hear about somebody else, someone you work with, a friend who was a cop, another firefighter that's gone. And I try not to think of it as a sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, that 20 years into this, hopefully it's gotten the people it's going to get and there will be no more. But obviously we know that's not true.
Thank you.